Welcome to my house. Enter freely, go safely, and leave some of the happiness that you bring. Hello, welcome to this podcast from Trinity College Dublin. I'm not Count Dracula, my name is Ronan Hodson. I work in the International Office in Trinity. And I am delighted to have you today to join me for a conversation with somebody in Trinity that I've been dying to have a conversation with for many years because we share certain interests. And that is Professor Jarlath Killeen from the School of English. Professor, are you there?
Hello.
Hi, Professor. How are you? Thanks for joining us today.
That's no problem.
Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween. A very unusual Halloween.
Yeah. A busy time for you, generally speaking, I understand.
Well, people get very interested in Dracula and vampires and all things monstrous around this time. So people want to talk about what scares them, and Dracula is central really to our culture's understanding of what is frightening. So it's always interesting to go back to Dracula. He sort of changes and metamorphizes in every single generation, has a different idea of him. So you never get tired of Dracula.
Okay, well, I couldn't agree more. Obviously, I think you can probably tell that I'm a bit of a Dracula fan. So we have some questions. I'll just pause a moment. We're just going live on Facebook. Technology is kicking in. I don't want anybody to miss this. Okay. All right, so we have a couple of questions just to get started. We'll go through the basics, and then anybody who is watching can tune in, and we'll see if anybody have any interesting questions that we have not already thought of. So let's just go straight back to the beginning, Professor. And who was Bram Stoker?
There's actually a number of ways you can try to address that question, and lots of different kinds of answers have been given about Bram Stoker. And probably the easiest one to start with is a very strictly biographical one. So Bram Stoker was a solidly middle-class Protestant Dubliner born in 1847, the height of the Irish famine, the worst year of the Irish famine. He was born in Marino Crescent in Clontarf, which is on the north side of Dublin City. His mother was from Sligo. She was Charlotte Thornley Blake. She was the daughter of an army officer, and his father was Abraham Stoker Sr., who was a civil servant who worked as a junior clerk in Dublin Castle in the office of the chief secretary for most of his life. I think that is actually a kind of crucial insight into what kind of a man Bram Stoker was, that this solidly middle-class professional background that he emerges out of, because he became, we know him now as a writer, but he was first of all really a civil servant. He went into the civil service when he was a teenager. He joined the civil service in 1866, and he was promoted fairly quickly, really, to the position of the Inspector of Courts of Petty Sessions. And this is not the kind of Stoker we often think of, the writer of Gothic novels, but he was, the first book he wrote was actually a book on the duties of the clerks of Petty Sessions. That was the first published book. He described it as dry as dust.
It sounds terrifying.
It's a book of kind of bureaucracy. It's a book of that codifies the rules and regulations and the best ways that the clerk should act. And he was a very bureaucratically minded civic person who was interested in paperwork and in modernizing bureaucracies, really. So he was a civil serviceman, as far as I'm concerned. And that plays through into his books. If you think about the heroes of his novels, particularly Dracula, the hero of the novel there is a solidly middle-class Protestant professional man, Jonathan Harker, really, who at the beginning of that novel is you send a solicitor, a newly qualified solicitor, over to finish off a property deal with a new client. Now it happens that this new client is Count Dracula, but it's a very basic, very middle class, very professional activity, and all he's doing is fulfilling his role as a bureaucrat and a newly qualified solicitor. Okay. So I think that's quite interesting to think of him as someone who's interested in paperwork, and also Dracula is composed of papers, typewritten papers, diaries, secretarial notes, phonographic transcriptions, newspaper clippings, and all compiled by Mina Harker, who is a kind of secretary to the crew of light, as they're often called. So again, it's a very solidly middle-class world we're talking about here when we're looking at Dracula.
Yeah. So unlike, say, Edgar Allan Poe, who would have been this kind of saturnine, gloomy character, if you were to pass Stoker in the street, you would never imagine him to be the kind of person who would imagine Dracula.
No, he's very, he should point out, no, he's a gigantic man, Bram Stoker, very tall man, very athletic, very physically imposing. But one thing that strikes you about him is that he often retreats into the background in relation to the people that he hangs around with. So when he leaves the civil service, he goes to work for probably the most famous actor in the world in this period. This is Henry Irving, the first actor to ever be knighted. A national treasure in some ways at this stage. And he goes to manage Henry Irving's life. Irving was a resident actor manager in the Lyceum Theatre, and Stoker basically acted as his personal assistant, his financial advisor, took over the running of the Lyceum, organized his tours. He tells us that he rarely reached the end of a morning without having written 50 letters for Irving. So he's again a bureaucrat really in Irving's life. But Irving is the key figure, and even in pictures where Stoker is present, he's often to the side or the forgotten figure, despite his physical presence. So I think that's quite interesting. He's not a very memorable character. Even the obituaries, when they were written about him after his death, didn't seem to have much to say about him personally, other than that he's a genial, warm, energetic figure. And then they go straight on to Irving and to Stoker's admiration of Irving and his intense work keeping Irving going, which was a lot of work. We're talking about a man who worked something like 16 to 17-hour days for Irving, writing 500,000 letters in his lifetime, only 2 of which are personal letters. I mean, it's extraordinary that we have all these letters that Stoker wrote, but they're all professional letters, except for 2 that he wrote to the poet Walt Whitman. So he's not someone who's very easy to get inside the head of, because we don't have the materials really. We only have the text. And what people tell us about him is that he was a genial person. He was friendly. He was, kind-hearted, very hardworking, extraordinarily hardworking. If you think about, the sort of stereotypical capitalist working all hours that God gave, this is Stoker. This is Stoker at his desk, 16, 17 hours a day, doing 3 or 4 or 5 different things constantly, finding time to write novels. Very little time with his family, very little time with his wife and his son. But it's not really the kind of image that we'd have of a Gothic novelist. I think that's often been quite a problem for people when they come to write biographies of Stoker.
Okay. Well, I mean, one of the other things, characteristics about him, and probably one of the main reasons why we're talking about him today, is that he was a graduate of Trinity College Dublin. And quite a distinguished graduate, I think. I mean, a little I'm aware of him. I know he was, as you say, physically impressive and intellectually well-rounded and very much involved in the student life. But I suppose one of the questions we would have is, how much of Trinity is in his writing? Was there some kind of Gothic undercurrent, a Gothic influence that he might have touched in Trinity that influenced the writing of books like Dracula?
Well, he's interesting. He's not very interesting as a student. I should sort of say that as a student, he is, as you say, well-rounded, and he was an average student. So he only attended Trinity full-time for 2 years, but he's certainly very involved in the social and intellectual life of Trinity College. So he's on one side, he's this extraordinary athlete. He's becomes the athletic champion of Dublin during his period in Trinity. He spends more time in the gym really than he does in the classroom. He's what we would now call a jock, and very, very strong. There's stories of him hanging from Trinity's trapeze in the gymnasium, holding 2 of his friends from a rope, from two ropes and lifting them up while he's hanging with, upside down. So this is a very, very strong man. He has prizes in weightlifting, in long distance walking. He does the trapeze, he does the slingshot, he's on the rugby team. So he's very involved in Trinity's athletic life, but then he's also involved in the intellectual life. So he becomes the auditor of the College Historical Society and also the president of the Phil, and he's the first person to hold both of these roles.
And the last, as far as I know, yeah.
Possibly the last two.
Yeah.
And he is, he's interested in lots of things. So we know he attends lectures on things like the supernatural in the English poets and the demonology of Milton. And he's, so he's interested in the intellectual currents of the time. We also know he's interested in politics. So the very first publication we can associate with him is his address as the auditor of the College Historical Society. And his address was called The Necessity for Political Honesty, which might be an interesting address to read now. That was in 1872. So he's interested in, everything really. He's a very curious mind. We also know that while he was in Trinity, he did make a number of visits to Martyr's Library. The current director of Martyr's Library, Jason McElligott, has had a very interesting online exhibition. If people click onto Martyr's Library, you'll see the books that Stoker was interested in, and some of them are very possibly influential in terms of the writing of Dracula. So there's a lot of intensely sectarian material from the 17th century, including material in which there is a mention of Vlad Dracula, the prince of Wallachia. So we're not absolutely certain that he paid much attention to this, but it's quite interesting that it's there. And the material he's consulting, quite a lot of it is very dark, very sectarian, and it depicts the world as involved in a kind of a war between the powers of good and evil. So I certainly recommend that as an interesting exhibition for anyone to look into Martyr's Library. And that was while he was a student here in Trinity. So yeah, the Gothic does feature, but the athletic, I think, is the big thing. And all his heroes are all athletes. All those the heroes of his novels, they're all men with gigantic chests, big arms, and who are interested in sport, including the heroes of the novel Dracula.
His cousin Oscar Wilde obviously was related to Stoker. He was also an enormous fan, wasn't he?
He was quite a big man too.
Yeah, so something in the blood there, you can only assume.
Of course, I should say that Stoker was the first boyfriend of the woman who would eventually go on to be Oscar Wilde's wife. So this was Florence Balcombe, who was considered the most attractive and beautiful woman in London when she went to live in London with Stoker. But she was first engaged to Wilde, and Stoker stole her away from Wilde. And this may be, because Stoker was a much more physically attractive man. I mean, for me, it's as simple as that. There's often that, why would you leave Oscar Wilde for Bram Stoker? Bram Stoker's not as interesting as Oscar Wilde, but he's much better looking.
Yeah, I agree. You've referred to him as a jock. I think most people would refer to him as a bear these days, but that's the topic of another conversation. So, I mean, Stoker, not the world's greatest, most recognized novelist at the time, or probably even now, but Dracula is endemic in Western culture. I think he's probably as recognizable as Santa Claus and Sherlock Holmes and Jesus Christ in terms of the 8 billion people on the planet. Why is that? Why did Dracula take off and become so ubiquitous in Western culture and pop culture?
Yeah, he's the most, I think, alongside Sherlock Holmes, he's the most filmed and adapted character in world literature. So that's something like 600 or 700 to 800 different versions of Dracula alone, from from Sesame Street to breakfast cereals with Count Chocula, I think. So it is interesting. Why did this take off? It didn't take off immediately. It was relatively successful at the time, but when you read the obituaries, they barely mention Dracula. So he dies in 1912. So by then it hadn't really taken off. But one thing it has that's very interesting is that Dracula himself in the novel, although he features quite heavily in the first few chapters, he then disappears. He then becomes quite a marginal figure. And this allows you and allows the reader to project all kinds of different ideas onto him about what is he doing? Why is he doing this? His motivation is quite vague. The kind of threat that he represents is also kind of amorphous or difficult to pin down. I think that alone was quite a useful thing for filmmakers in the early 20th century to start to use. So he could become all kinds of things. So if you look at the first film adaptation that we have that's extant is Murnau's 1922 adaptation Nosferatu. This was a completely it was not meant to be. He didn't get permission from the widow to adapt it. He disguised Dracula as Count Orlok, but anyone who watches this film and reads the novel will see that it is an adaptation. And here he's a very monstrous figure. He's an ugly man. One critic describes him as looking like a penis with teeth, and he represents plague. He comes in a ship that's full of rats, and he represents disease and really the abject, the disgusting. But later he could then be, just a decade later, he's transformed into a heartthrob with Bela Lugosi's performance in Todd Browning's Hollywood version of Dracula. That's 1932, 1933. And so now he becomes mesmerically sexy and becomes a kind of a leading man. And after that, he's played traditionally as quite a physically attractive character. So I think what we have is this character who is quite blank in the novel in many ways. And that means you can project all kinds of things. And each generation has found different ideas in him. So he represents all kinds of different fears. You move him around from geographical area to different time zones to different historical periods. He keeps representing something different, and that's what he offers really in a way that other vampires don't. Partly because in other vampire texts we're given a lot more backstory, we're given a lot more detail about what the vampire is doing. He's a slippery character who's quite difficult to clarify and to pin down.
Okay, I'd never thought about it that way before, and it never really occurred to me that Bela Lugosi, who I suppose was one of the first versions of Dracula to really crystallize the image. I mean, the costume and the widow's peak and the frowning face and the heavy eyebrows. But he was a young man, and he was quite, I suppose, had some kind of mysterious exotic charm. And that kind of brings us on to one of the questions that we've got in from somebody watching, and that is, I mean, how did you've started, I suppose, to talk about that a little bit, but that progression from the hideous Count Orlok to a more attractive villain in like Lugosi and later versions, to an outright romantic hero, a protagonist in a lot of more recent pop culture versions of the vampire. And how did that metamorphosis happen? And what were the important turning points there?
Yeah, I think the key there is that by associating him so closely with sexuality, he can transform as sexuality. The discourse around sexuality changes. So if you're looking at Lugosi in the 1930s, or even Christopher Lee at the end of the 1950s, we're still talking about an era in which sexual transgression is kind of exotic, scary, dangerous, threatening. But then as the 60s progress, Dracula, in contrast to the kind of supposedly repressive Victorian culture in which many of the films are set, can start to look much more modern. Like he's like a 60s free love advocate. And if you think of Frank Langella's version of Dracula in the 1970s, he's the good guy in that, because he's surrounded by these deeply repressed men who don't like women's sexuality. And in comes Dracula, like some kind of Indiana Jones of the bedroom, going to save the women from these horrible men and take them away and release their inner sexuality. So he becomes associated with a kind of reaction to repression, and particularly repressed sexuality. And the other current is that as you're moving through the 20th century, monsters become much more sympathetic in general. Because monsters come in many ways to represent those who are marginalized by a society that monsters those it doesn't like. With the 60s and the 70s and political revolution going on really in the Western world, monsters become much more sympathetic because they're those, they represent those cultures and those communities and those people who have been marginalized by the dominant forces of Western society. So it becomes much easier to see vampires as sympathetic figures. I suppose one of the key films here is something like Martin, directed by the director of the zombie series. Name is George Romero. In that, he's like this misunderstood teenage boy who's really only thinking that he's a vampire because he feels so marginalized and left out. And we have this kind of vampire next door character. So you combine the sympathetic marginalized figure with the extraordinarily sexually attractive figure, and that's where you get Edward Cullen really with the Twilight series. So he's both, he feels this, he's an angst-ridden teenager who feels marginalized and neglected, but he's also extremely attractive, very, he's the most beautiful man who's ever existed, and nobody can resist him. So I think that's where you get it. And I suppose I kind of miss the straightforwardly evil vampire who's not complicated. He's not that complicated. He's the Antichrist who wants to destroy all that's good.
Yeah, I mean, I meant to ask you about that. So I'm like you, I'm a Dracula purist. He's a villain. He's a bad guy. I think that's what Stoker intended. And I think actually the Langella film is important because that's one of the first ones where you start to see this idea of the starstruck match between Dracula and Mina. This idea of reincarnation, which I think is exemplified in the fanciful Coppola Bram Stoker's movie, where that is the plot and the horror is kind of a subplot behind that. What do you think Stoker would think if he were to, or is thinking now, looking down from wherever he is at these versions of Dracula, who is basically kind of a soppy, lovesick, undead puppy? Would he recognize his creation at all?
I think he would be. I think first of all he would be extremely surprised that this is what he's remembered for. I mean that would be the surprise, the first thing. So that's just to register that the shock of Dracula being the text that he's remembered for, rather than his biography of Henry Irving. And secondly, he as far as he's concerned, Dracula first of all is not sexually attractive. He has bad breath. He's hairy hands. He's this long military mustache. He doesn't talk really about love. Mina is not his reincarnated wife. He is a servant of Satan, so he's been involved in occult activity. He's been schooled in occult secret societies, and he is trying to bring about a new order, which is run by on anti-Christian lines. He wants to reverse the order of Christianity. Whether sex is all that important in the novel is a key scholarly question, and it's generated a huge amount of debates. But what's very clear is that religious issues are sort of straightforwardly central to this text, and that Stoker represents a kind of the enemy of God. The idea that he would be like falling in love with Mina and things like that. He does in the novel say, I am taking Mina from you. She is now blood of my blood, flesh of my flesh, after he makes her drink the blood from his chest. So there are marriage and sexual metaphors going on. But he's doing this in order to consummate a kind of anti-Christian marriage. He's inverting the language of the Christian marriage ceremony. That's really what's going on there. So I think that Stoker would be somewhat surprised that a vampire could become a heroic and very sympathetic figure in today's culture.
No, I agree. Well, Dracula doesn't belong to him anymore. I think it belongs to everybody. No, so right. He doesn't get a say in the matter. But
he created this myth. I think he's now kind of free from the pages of the novel. And people who've don't even realize that there is a novel called Dracula will know who Dracula is. Who've never heard of Bram Stoker, but know who Dracula is, and will recognize, the kind of Bela Lugosian, "I want to drink your blood," that accent. And I think that is some achievement to create a modern myth.
One of the questions we had was about Stoker's interest in the occult, and you touched on it a little bit there. The novel that has tantalizing glimpses of mention of the scholomance, which is very obscure Roman mythology about people secretly learning black magic from the devil up the mountains in Carpathia. And you spoke about him probably finding some juicy bits and pieces in Marsh's library, but was this an ongoing preoccupation of those? That there was a spiritualist magical revival at the time? Was he adjacent to that? Did he really care about that kind of stuff?
I suppose one thing to say is that there's probably not a novel written in the 1890s that doesn't have some reference or other to the occult, because the occult was going through this extraordinary revival. There was occult organizations everywhere. There were theosophists, electrobiologists, hypnotists, spiritualists, Rosicrucians, and particularly, I suppose, the Order of the Golden Dawn, which was probably best known because W.B. Yeats was a member of it. We know that there had been some speculation about whether Stoker was a member of the Order of the Golden Dawn, but there's no evidence that he was. But it would have been highly unusual if he hadn't been interested in the occult, just because everyone was interested in the occult in this period. And he often brings up occult activity in his other texts. He's also interested in Egyptomania in a book like Jewel of the Seven Stars. So there is certainly occult elements, but it's probably because Britain was going through this occult revival, in which everyone was interested in these alternative versions of spirituality. But we have no evidence that he was personally a member. He was friendly with a number of members, including someone who was quite high up in the organization, John William Brodie Enns, who was also a horror writer, and he was a good friend of Stoker's. We know, for example, that Oscar Wilde's wife was a member of the Order of the Golden Dawn. So, he did know people who were in it, but we don't have evidence that he was. And the evidence, I suppose, is that he was, I would say, a conventional Anglican thinker who was interested in Christianity as the, finding a route out of the, I suppose it would be the kind of crisis of faith of the late Victorian period, which is one of the causes of the occult revival. People are looking for answers. Conventional Christianity didn't seem to offer them anymore, so people went off into all kinds of occult and interesting avenues, and I think that Stoker was worried about this, and that one thing you could say about the novel is that it associates the evil of Count Dracula with being schooled in occult and black magic.
Right.
So that he represents a threat to the conventional Anglicanism of people like Jonathan Harker and Lord Godalming, who is called Lord Godalming, which is Lord God Almighty. I mean, it's quite blunt about that there in the novel.
So again, Stoker as the middle of the road kind of good Victorian man, the defender of the faith and suspicious of foreigners and that kind of thing.
But not all foreigners, of course, because Van Helsing is a Dutch Catholic, interestingly enough, who speaks in a very kind of strange English. Despite having an MLit from Oxford, he speaks very strange English. But he is the person who provides all the answers to how you're going to get rid of a Dracula. So he's not an insular figure, Stoker. He's interested particularly in the international order. So if you think about the crew of light, you have the American in Quincy Stoker, you have the Dutch figure of Van Helsing, and then you have these traditional English figures, including the aristocrat, but it's mostly middle-class figures. So he is an internationalist. He's interested in, he thought America was the future. He said the 20th century was going to be the American century. So he was, he did understand how international politics was working. And you find that there's plenty of that in Dracula.
Well, there are no obvious mentions of Ireland or Irishness in the novel. But I mean, a lot of people ask and theorize about how Irish was Dracula. I'm not talking about ideas that the name comes from Draculas, which is the Irish for bad blood. I think the name pretty obviously comes from Vlad the Impaler. But there are, people will talk about the influences of Irish folklore on Stoker's imagination. As you mentioned, he was born at the height of the famine, which was a horrific period. So, I mean, do you see any of that? Any legitimate connection?
I think there's a few legitimate connections. I think it's important, for example, so that he's born in the height of the famine in the middle of a cholera epidemic, His mother had already lived through a cholera epidemic in Sligo in the 1830s, and she provided quite a graphic Gothic account of what it was like to live through this epidemic in Sligo in that period. And there's language in that about the punishment of God on sin. There's talk about bodies being buried alive. And it's highly likely that he's influenced by this. There's also the influence of just a country going through a crisis like the famine, and how that would impact on somebody's mentality, particularly you grow up in that period. So I think what you're probably looking at here is less a direct relationship and more a sort of a resonance of some of the themes and debates that were in Ireland in this period. You also have sort of more political elements. So you have with Dracula a landlord, a parasitic landlord, and some people have pointed this out as being, again, resonant of some of the ideas in Ireland in the late 19th century. And and you also have, with Dracula invading England and trying to undermine it from within. Some people talk about him as a kind of reverse colonizing invader. And you can see elements there. I would be careful in trying to pin it down exactly, because it's a Gothic novel. It works on all these different levels. It's trying to draw in a lot of anxieties. And the great thing about it is you can find anything you really want. If you look at the kind of explanations of what's going on in Count Dracula that have been put forward by literary critics, he's come to represent everything. So you talk about anti-Semitism, you talk about Irishness, you can talk about capitalism, sexuality, disease. People are probably coming up with more readings as we're sitting here talking. So it's become this extraordinary metaphor for anything that was causing anxiety in the late Victorian period. Dracula, it's there. You can find it, and it's probably true. You probably can find it, because Stoker he's working on it for 7 years. Lots of things filtered into it. So you are going to be able to find lots of different ideas and fears represented.
Well, I suppose that's why we need people like you, Professor Killeen, because you are active in Dracula studies. You teach English in this School of English in Trinity, and I just want to ask. I mean, for people who are watching, who might be interested in seriously studying Gothic literature, and maybe in particular Irish Gothic literature, Dracula. What are the avenues? I mean, what for instance, students that you teach, what kind of things do they look at, or what kind of research opportunities are there in Trinity and elsewhere?
Yeah, so I mean, I teach a course called the Victorian Gothic to 3rd and 4th year students, and they read texts like Dracula, Jekyll and Hyde, Wuthering Heights, Dr. Moreau. So they read those novels, and then they often write very long essays on these novels. So they study this as a major part of their degree. Other colleagues teach things like late Victorian crime fiction or American Gothic. So there's actually quite a lot of this. I suppose Trinity has now become a kind of center of Gothic studies, really, and certainly in their as you move through your undergraduate career, you can certainly study an awful lot or take an awful lot of modules on Gothic and horror literature. And a lot of people have written their dissertations. So I've been reading dissertations last year on things like cannibalism, on zombie fiction, on vampires, right up to the sort of contemporary material. So there's loads of opportunity for studying horror and Gothic material in English in Trinity.
Okay, great. Well, I mean, I wish I knew that when I was filling out my Leaving Cert application. Instead of studying physics, I could have been studying Dracula and cannibalism and Jack the Ripper and so forth. So maybe when I retire, I'll go back and do a degree. Okay, well, this has been amazing. We're coming up to, I suppose, what we should be wrapping up the end of this, but I just want to ask you one very, very basic question, and you don't feel any need to kind of dwell on it, but like, what is your favorite pop culture manifestation of Dracula? What film or anything else? Anyone else's version of Dracula that you think either nailed it or just is cool in its own right?
I'm quite fond of the version called Love at First Bite where George Hamilton plays Dracula, a Dracula who's heartily sick of living in Transylvania, and he has a brilliant line, something like, you know, the children, he's listening to the wolves howling outside the door, and he says, "The children of the night, I wish they'd shut up," or something like that. And he goes to live in 1970s New York, and tries to live it up. And I think I'm very, very, I remember seeing that as a teenager and thinking, you know, I remember it quite fondly. So that would be a sort of a recommendation for people to seek that out. The best version, I think, to be honest, is still Nosferatu from 1922. I think that's the most disturbing version. I think it remains it's not particularly faithful to the novel, but none of even Bram Stoker's Dracula by Francis Ford Coppola is not Bram Stoker's Dracula. But I think it is the Nosferatu of 1922 is the most disturbing, and the images are impossible to forget.
Well, great. I have not heard of that George Hamilton, but I will have to look it up. There's plenty of opportunity for binge watching vampire movies over Halloween, which I suppose I will be doing. Thank you so much for lending us your time. I know you have a busy Halloween because your wheelhouse becomes especially interesting to everybody. I suppose anybody who's interested in knowing more about your work can find your stuff on the Trinity website under the School of English. Yep. Anybody who's interested in talking to us about enrolling in Trinity to study in the School of English, which is, I might add, one of the highest ranking schools of English in Europe and in the world, and as you've just heard, is developing as a centre for excellence in the study of Gothic. If you're interested in investigating those opportunities, contact us at international@tcd.ie, international@tcd.ie, and we'll tell you what the options are and the procedures to go about it. And with that, I will bid Professor Killeen goodbye, and to all the rest of you watching, I would say thank you for being with us and happy Halloween.
Thank you. Take care.
See you.